Well, it is wonderful to be back here once again to see the extended McClish family and, of course, everybody else that was here before. Tanya, it's good to see you too again. And I'll give you the same qualifier I gave Dub and Phil whenever I sent the topic for this sermon, that even though the title is in Latin, I promise this is not a Catholic sermon. This is not a Latin Mass. But if you looked at the newsletter, it has the title there, because I'm about to say it, but you probably won't know what I just said. Praestat, Cautela, Quam, Medela. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, it means prevention is better than cure. I only chose that because it was a phrase I ran across, and I saw it. I thought, you know what, that's a really good idea. That's a good principle. What does the Bible have to say about it? So that's how I came up with it. But this principle, the idea that prevention is better than cure, that's something that I was vaguely aware of whenever I was growing up, but I saw it more precisely demonstrated, very precisely articulated whenever I was in the Navy. Whenever we're in the Navy, we have a whole lot of maintenance to do, as you might imagine. Warships have to have a lot of work done to keep them running. And generally, we have our maintenance divided into two major categories, preventive and corrective. So the idea being that you do preventive maintenance just like you do preventive maintenance on, say, your house. You want to take care of the small messes, keep them from getting too big, because if you let things get out of hand, they become more and more difficult to deal with later on. Same idea with the Navy. You do preventive maintenance on equipment, so you open up electrical cabinets, you open up mechanical equipment, make sure that it's still running fine on the inside, inspect it, make sure it's good, lubricate things as you need to, so on and so forth. And you want to do that in order to prevent the corrective maintenance. So say, for a specific example, we had reduction gears on the main engines of our submarine. A big old giant gear, like taller than this room right here. One of them anyway, one of the gears. And they were extremely expensive, millions of dollars. Obviously, we don't want to do corrective maintenance on that thing. We don't want it to wear down to the point that it's going to break, and then we have to spend millions of dollars to replace it, and on top of that, a whole bunch of people would probably get fired. It would be a very, very unpleasant situation for everybody involved. So they do preventive maintenance, and they do it very carefully in order to preclude having to replace it, in order to preclude that corrective maintenance. You think about the same thing with something that's maybe a little more applicable to the common folk, cars. You do oil changes on your cars, and you do that in order to prevent the engine from seizing up. You don't want to have to replace the entire engine. It's a hassle maybe to do oil changes. You have to keep up with them, but it's going to save you a whole lot of time and heartache in the long run, and money on top of that. And for something that maybe the folks here in this room know a lot better than I do, you'd much rather have preventive medicine than corrective medicine. You'd rather eat the right things, take all the vitamins that you need, keep up with that your whole life, rather than later on having to deal with corrective surgeries and all the pain that comes along with that. Again, what does the Bible have to say about any of this? Well, the verse that I found that most lines up, if you will, with that, with the idea of preventive maintenance being better than corrective, is Proverbs chapter 17. And we're going to be in Proverbs most of the time today. Proverbs 17 and verse 14. And there it says, "The beginning of strife is like releasing water, therefore stop contention before a quarrel starts." Now that verse there, it's talking specifically about relationships and how you speak to people, saying you should not let contention start. You should stop arguments from escalating before they get out of hand. So the same idea. You take preventive measures in interacting with your fellow man in order to prevent conflicts. Because once the conflict starts, it's like the verse says there, it's like releasing water. Once you pour water out of your glass, or once a dam breaks, you're not going to get it back to where it was before. Same thing with the phrase of no use crying over spilled milk. Yeah, because you're not going to get it back off the floor into your vessel. So practice preventive maintenance in relationships. That's what the Bible tells us to do, because it's far easier to do that than to deal with the fallout, with the after effects of a major argument, of alienating somebody, ruining your own reputation, ruining a relationship, burning a bridge with somebody. Now, as is often the case with things in the Bible, there's not just one verse on the subject. Specifically with regard to relationships, still in Proverbs, we have more about it. In Proverbs 15:1, it says there, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The idea being that you take the time and measure your responses, measure your words in speaking with other people in order to prevent a misunderstanding, in order to prevent them from taking your words and misinterpreting them and causing conflict that would otherwise be avoided if you had taken a little more time and maybe come up with the proper words, a soft answer to turn away wrath. Likewise, chapter 18 and verse 19 of Proverbs, they're saying, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city, and contentions are like the bars of a castle. It's far harder to win someone over after you've already alienated them. And the principle is also practically applied. It's like all those real-world examples I gave of mundane things that prevention being better than corrective maintenance could be applied to. The Bible also talks about similarly mundane things that you can apply the principle to. In Proverbs chapter 6, in verse 6 through 8, it says there, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which, having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. Saying, overall, don't be lazy. When you think about what's being said there, like consider the ant. It's working in the summer to provide for her supplies in the winter. We do that. Humans have been doing that for ages. We don't have to worry about it as much today with the preponderance of food that we have access to all the time. But back in ye olden days, whenever you'd be working on the farm day in and day out, you were doing so in order to provide food for the winter because you wouldn't have access to the ability to farm during the winter. You had to stock up, you had to stockpile, you had to make sure that you weren't going to starve. You had to do all the preventive maintenance up front in order to prevent starvation later on. And that's precisely what this is saying. And likewise, in chapter 10, verse 4 and 5, it says there, he who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Somebody who's lazy is going to, in the long run, get poorer and poorer. Somebody who's diligent, who takes the time to do like the small things day to day that you need to do in order to build up wealth, in order to have a livelihood, that is the person who's going to obviously succeed. And he who gathers in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame. Chapter 10 and verse 5. Same idea as the ant. You do things on the front end in order to prevent heartache on the back end. In chapter 12 and verse 11. He who tills his land will be satisfied with bread, but he who follows frivolity is devoid of understanding. Certainly frivolity is something that a lot of people fall victim to today. And it's very easy in this day and age with all the technology that we have access to that distracts us day in and day out, the younger generation especially. I'm not saying older folks are exempt from it, but I'm sure we're all very well aware of the current generation's proclivity to spend time on video games, social media, all things of the sort, myself guilty of it to some extent too, although thankfully not as much as I used to be. But he who tills his land will be satisfied with bread. He who takes the time to do the work day to day will be satisfied, will have the gains that he needs in order to survive. He who follows frivolity is devoid of understanding and will fall prey to poverty and starvation later on. Now, something that's on a related note but slightly different than the idea we're talking about here. This is chapter 14 and verse 4, where it says, "Where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox." Still talking about preventive maintenance in a way, because it's saying you have a whole lot of gain to be had by the strength of an ox. Today, say, with a truck. You have a whole lot of work that you can do that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do in nearly the same amount of time. Having a work truck for a farm, say, enables a farmer to do a whole lot more, haul a lot more equipment, get things where he needs them to be in a much more timely manner than if he was just trying to do it off the strength of his back alone. And same thing with farmers in the past that were using oxen to accomplish the work that they needed on their farms. But verse 3 there, or the first part of verse 4 there is saying, "Where no oxen are, the trough is clean." So it's saying, if you don't have the ox, well, then you don't have to worry about taking care of it, building a barn for it, filling its feeding trough every single day, cleaning up after it and all the poop that you're going to have to deal with in the field and on the farm and in the barn. So it's saying, practice a little bit of cost-benefit analysis. Do you need the ox? Do you need the work truck? Do you need whatever the thing is that you would have to spend a lot of money on and also have to do a lot of maintenance to keep up with? Is it worth that? It's saying, take that into account. Is it worth the time and effort to take care of the thing? Is the benefit from whatever you're considering worth the gain you get thereby? Now, something that's of great import today, and that perhaps more than anything else this morning that we're going to talk about, certainly this principle is very applicable to, is raising children. And Proverbs has a lot to say on that, and I'm sure we're all well aware. In chapter 13 and verse 24, it says there, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly." I'm sure all the parents here can attest and know far better than I do that if you don't discipline your kids as they're growing up, then it's going to be next to impossible, if not outright impossible, to correct them later on in life. And there in verse 24, despite what a lot of folks today in the modern world and the secular world say, they say, oh, you can just do gentle parenting. You don't need to correct your children. You don't need to do these barbaric things of the past. You don't need to spank them. You don't need to tell them that they're wrong. You just reward them when they're doing the right thing, and whenever they're doing the wrong thing, you just very gently say, oh, no, it's okay. You don't have to stop, but I'd really wish you did, and then the children keep on doing the wrong thing and acting out. But what's verse 24 saying? He who spares his rod hates his son. It's not even that you don't love them, you hate your children if you don't discipline them. Here, according to Proverbs, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Now, the mistake of the folks who have the behavior that I just talked about, the sort of folks who insist that gentle parenting is all you need, that no discipline is ever necessary, and to do so is even cruel, they make a great mistake. They equate love with gentleness. Now, gentleness is certainly a part of love, but like the writer here, like Solomon here says, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Discipline is a part of love. We say tough love sometimes, but there's no real need to add that adjective to it, because love is tough sometimes. Love is gentle sometimes. Love is telling your friends who you want to be who you want to be amiable with, who you want to be on good terms with. Sometimes it's telling them when they're doing something wrong, and they might not take it very well, but you still do it anyway because you love them. The sort of friend who won't tell you when you're wrong, the sort of friend who refuses to ever correct their counterparts, well, they were never really a friend to begin with. They didn't love. Love is wanting the best for other people. Sometimes that best sort of love that you can give will be gentleness. Sometimes it's going to be discipline. chapter 22 and verse 6, we read a little bit more about this, where it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Emphasizing again the great importance of giving discipline, of training a child early on, so that later on you don't have to worry about them being unable to make the proper choice in whatever situation they find themselves in. Because if you train them properly, they're going to know what the right thing to do is. And in verse 15 of that same chapter, it says, "Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him." A child is not going to know what's best for them while they're still young. That's why the parent is there, in order to guide them, in order to prevent them from letting their own whims drive their every action. Foolishness being bound up in their heart. So it takes the parents' constant preventive maintenance, constantly telling the child what's wrong and what's right, constantly disciplining the child in order to keep them in the proper path. Because again, if you never discipline your child, and then you realize whenever they're 18, 19, 20 years old that, oh, I should have been doing that a long time ago, I guess I'll start now, it's not going to work. The time for corrective maintenance when it comes to raising children, well, it's going to be, like I said, next to impossible to do by the time they're an adult. Preventive maintenance is necessary in raising children. In chapter 23, in verse 13, it says, "Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell." And there it's saying, if you discipline the child, he's not going to die. If you beat him with a rod, if you spank him, they're not going to die. They might not like it. You might not like doing it. But it's necessary. Because you do it when they're children, because later on, if they make the same sort of mistakes when they're an adult and they're out in the world, there's not going to be any second chances a lot of times. If they misbehave while they're at work, they're just going to get fired. If they misbehave and decide to go down all the various and sundry horrible paths that children can go these days, whether addiction to drugs or alcohol or social media, addiction to pornography, all these things. You raise the child early on, teach them the proper way early on, so that whenever they make a mistake, when they're children, you can supply the proper punishment. That's not going to kill them. It's not going to be horrible for them. They're not going to be irrecoverable. Because if they make those same mistakes later on, it will be nearly irrecoverable. It will be extremely difficult compared to the discipline that you would give them beforehand. And likewise, this principle can be applied to reputation. In chapter 20 and verse 11 of Proverbs, it says there, "Even a child is known by his deeds, whether what he does is pure and right." So still on the subject of children, but this time it's saying, your children will be known by their deeds. Even they have a reputation to maintain. If you're providing the proper discipline for a child, then other people will notice. They'll see how well behaved your children are. Whenever you go out into public places, if they're not throwing a temper tantrum just because you refuse to give them an ice cream cone, well, that's a well-behaved child. And it's because the parent was diligent in teaching them right from wrong, and teaching them that they're not always going to get exactly what they want at any given time. And likewise, it's applicable to our reputation as adults. In chapter 21 and verse 23, "Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles." Again, hearkening back to the first verse that I referenced, chapter 17 and verse 14, where it says, "Strife is like releasing water, therefore stop contention before a quarrel starts." Same idea. Guard your mouth and tongue to keep your soul from trouble. Take the time to think about what you're going to say. Take the time to think about how you're communicating with other people. Because again, it's far easier to take small measures early on to think about what you're going to say than it is to, after you've said something foolish, something rash, something that maybe you didn't even mean, to then try to reconcile with the sort of people, whoever you offended. In chapter 22 and verse 1, saying there, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. Your good name, your reputation, is far easier to maintain early on. Again, small preventive measures by not going to certain places as a Christian, not going out to bars, because once you've been seen there and somebody else witnesses it and the rumors start spreading, well, it's going to be nearly impossible to correct that. It's far harder to perform corrective maintenance on your reputation, if you will, after you've already been witnessed doing something that you ought not to have been doing, or some place that you shouldn't have been. Even if, say, you were there for a good purpose, say you were like wanting to evangelize perhaps for some reason in a bar, but you were sitting at a table, not actually up preaching or anything. Not that I would recommend doing that. I don't think they'd be very receptive, but in any case, it's far easier to take the time to think about the sorts of things that you're going to do, whether your actions or your words are going to cause damage, than to try to correct it after it's already done. And the principle can be applied to your conscience as well. Read Proverbs 4, verse 14 through 17. There it says, I was on the verge of total ruin. Oh, wait, no, that's chapter 5. Sorry. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they do not sleep unless they have done evil, and their sleep is taken away unless they make someone fall. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. Before that, it's talking about the sorts of people who lie in wait for people on the road, those who are seeking to do wickedness. So do not even enter the path of the wicked. Do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it. Turn away from it and pass on. It's like, don't even begin to associate with the sort of people who seek to do evil, because you're training yourself to become desensitized to the things that they're doing. Obviously, whenever somebody's starting to do improper things, sinful things, they're not going to just go from sitting alone in their house to suddenly murdering a whole bunch of people. They're going to start out small. We have the same sort of idea with like gateway drugs, starting with marijuana, moving up to something like cocaine. It's the same sort of idea, but this time it's with moral action. Saying there in verse 16, their sleep is taken away unless they make someone fall. Saying these people that have trod the path of the wicked for so long have become so askewed, their conscience seared with a hot iron, have become so used to doing evil that they can't sleep unless they do it. They can't sleep unless they've murdered somebody for their goods, as is referenced here in chapter 4. People can't sleep today unless they steal from others, unless they take advantage and manipulate others. They can't sleep unless they sin, because their conscience has become so desensitized to what is right and good by constantly practicing evil. And so this is saying, perform preventive maintenance. Don't even start on the path of evil. If you find yourself starting to do certain things, engaging in certain behaviors, stop it then and there, rather than continuing on that path for so long that then your conscience becomes so hardened that you're incapable, almost, of ever returning. Because it'll be far easier to stop it when it's small than later on to end up like these people that Solomon is talking about, the bandits on the road that seek to murder people just for the coin in their pocket. and they derive joy from doing so. Don't let your conscience become so desensitized that you derive joy from sin, because that can happen. Now, these are all very specific applications. What about the overall principle? How can we apply this more broadly? Well, think about the entire book, or entire purpose of the book of Proverbs. In chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, it says there, "My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head and chains about your neck." The entire purpose of the book of Proverbs was to prevent Solomon's son from making mistakes. Saying, "Son, heed my words, pay attention to these things that I'm writing down for you, because if you do so, it's going to be far better for you in the long run. Take the time to apply these principles now, because it's going to be far easier for you than if you were to try to correct your behavior later on." And likewise in chapter 3 in verse 9 and 10, it says, "Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine." Be diligent in serving the Lord. Sacrifice as you are called to, for the Jews specifically here, but the underlying principle still applies to us today. Be diligent in serving the Lord, and you will be blessed later on for it, rather than just being lazy and undiligent in your doings, and then it's going to be harder and harder later on to return to the proper path. I think about another way that we can apply this, first to God's earlier people, the Israelites. You think about what Moses said to them before they crossed the Jordan in Deuteronomy. He was saying to them, "If you keep the commandments of the Lord, as the Lord has delivered them to me," and also included with those commandments blessings and cursings according to your behavior. Saying if you keep the Lord's commandments, you'll receive even greater blessings. The Lord was already giving them the promised land, but he was saying, "I'm going to give you even greater increase if you will take the time and be diligent in keeping my commandments." And likewise, Moses said, if you shirk your duty, if you don't take the time to prevent yourselves from becoming more and more entrenched in the evil of the nations round about you, if you don't take the time to care about the commandments that I have delivered to you, then you're going to be suffering even more than what you suffered previously whenever you disobeyed. Calamity will come upon you to correct your misbehavior. That's what Moses was saying to them. That was demonstrated in the captivity. That was God's corrective action to the great and heinous disobedience of Israel. God had to take that corrective action in order to get them to finally repent, because they refused to. They were a stiff-necked people. They're saying if you had practiced preventive maintenance on the front end, if you had just kept the Lord's commandments to begin with, then you wouldn't be suffering this great calamity that's going to come. It would be far easier to simply obey God's commands in order to prevent the great calamity that they had been told would come upon them. And there is also a very good application to be had from the New Testament. In the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew chapter 25, Jesus there explaining it, he says, 5 of the virgins were wise, 5 were foolish. The 5 wise kept spare oil for their lamps so that they would be prepared for how late the feast would be. The 5 foolish, realizing that they were going to run out, that their lamps would not be able to be trimmed, said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil." And What did the wise say to them? No. Lest we should not have enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell, buy for yourselves. The 5 wise were prepared. They took the time to prevent the situation from occurring that was occurring for the foolish ones right now. They took the time and the diligence to be prepared for the Lord's coming, for the Master's coming. They understood just how the great gravity of the situation they were in. That's what Jesus is saying to us with this. Be prepared for the Lord's coming, because you don't know when he's going to come. And you don't want to be like the 5 foolish virgins who were lazy, who didn't take the proper preventive measures in their lives. And then whenever the Master came, they were left outside. The Master said, I don't know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. Just like for raising children, once they reach a certain age, it's nearly impossible to correct their behavior. The parent prevents them from becoming ingrained in their misbehavior by providing discipline early on and constantly throughout the raising of the child. And it's precisely the same way with our souls. We have to take the time and be diligent in correcting ourselves day by day, rather than letting ourselves become so wicked, so ingrained in sin, that later on, whenever we realize just how bad it is, it's going to be, again, incredibly difficult to correct that horrible state of affairs. So if there are those here who haven't been keeping up with their preventive maintenance, if you will, who haven't been doing the things that they ought, who have not been maintaining their soul as well as perhaps they should, let it be known. If there are those here who have come to understand the gospel, have heard it, believe it, then understand that you must repent and turn away from your evil ways. Confess Jesus as the Son of God and be baptized for the washing away of your sins. If there are any of those here who need help with any of these things that I've talked about, let it be known while we stand